Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
The wife has decided to put her husband in an unpleasant state, but because of what situation? Today's story with a similar plot. Enjoy watching it. It was Saturday morning around 2 o'clock when the light in the kitchen chandelier went out. At first, I thought the light bulb had burned out, but then I noticed that the clock on the microwave had also gone out. My first thought was that the machine in the basement had tripped, so I went to the back door to call my husband, Don, who was working in the yard, trying to restore the barn that was in dire need of repair. He was walking back towards the house when I opened the door to call him. Before I could explain the problem, he muttered, "Damn machine guns. I must have caught one with a power saw." "Darling, everything in the kitchen has turned off too," I said. When he went down to the basement to check the machines, he returned a few minutes later with a puzzled look on his face. He stated that not a single machine had worked. He had turned them all on and off just in case one was stuck. He then walked around the house, trying to turn on the lights, the TV, anything that ran on electricity. Nothing worked. He returned to the basement to double-check but found nothing unusual. We knew the house needed updates, including the electrical system, when we bought it about 8 months ago. However, the price was right, and as they say in real estate, location, location, location. It may not be for everyone, but it was exactly what we were looking for, a 2-acre lot with a 5-room house, 1 room of which we could convert into an office for Dawn and 3 more for the family we planned to have. As the improvements have just begun, my husband, a typical jack of all trades and master of none, could do most of the work himself. His father was an independent contractor, and by working with him through high school and college, Don learned a lot. Not the small stuff, but he could handle most of the grunt work. We both grew up in Jacksonville and lived in a studio apartment for the first 5 years of our marriage. I worked as a bank teller, and Don was busy as a software developer. He developed several programs that his employer patented and made significant profits. Unfortunately, neither his salary nor his modest bonuses reflected this. We both agreed that with the money we had saved, we could afford to fulfill our dreams of moving to the countryside, buying a house, and becoming country folk. Don would be able to work from home, continue his software development while avoiding the commuting time, and renovate his home. Neither of us had previous marriages, but each of us had been in relationships. I had several casual relationships and 1 long-term friends with benefits relationship. Don was living with a girl he was engaged to before she rekindled her romance with her former college sweetheart and left him after 2 years of dating. My serious relationship at that time ended when I accidentally found out that my significant other was interested in both pretty. This unsettled me for a while, and both Don and I were victims of the once burned, twice careful theory. When we met, we dated, although not exclusively, for a year. Even after he proposed, we lived apart for another 6 months before finally moving in together for another year before the wedding. After we determined that there was no power in the house, Don and I assumed that a local power outage must be the cause of our problem. When there was no power after several hours, I decided to call the electric company, especially since it would soon be dark. I was surprised to find that the phone line was not working, and my cell phone was also dead. Don went outside to continue working on the barn without the aid of power tools. When I went out to tell him about our new problem, he seemed worried and returned to the house with me. One of our problems was that we didn't really have any friends or neighbors in our new area. Well, you could call it a neighborhood loosely, since we lived in a rural area. Other than the man next door, the nearest house was a quarter of a mile away, and that house appeared to be the family farm, located several hundred feet from the road. Our neighbor's house was about 400 to 500 feet from us, but the same distance from the road as ours. There was a neatly erected chicken fence between our plots. Although our lot extended about 400 feet from the back of the house to the wood line, his side yard extended another 600 to 700 feet to the south and contained several small barns and a large barn. When we first moved in, we went out one afternoon to meet our neighbors. As we approached the house, we heard large dogs barking and growling inside. Before we got to the door, a man came out of the house, closing the door behind him, and stood on the porch waiting for us to approach. We went up to the porch, and I greeted him. "Hi, we are your new neighbors." We decided to meet. "My name is Carrie Proper, and this is my husband, Donald." We extended our hands, which he shook after a pause. Bobo Johnson, he introduced himself. Although there was no hostility in his gaze, there was no warmth in it either. He was quite tall, maybe 6 feet 3 inches, with a muscular build, dark brown hair, and the lightest, brightest blue eyes I had ever seen. He didn't appear to have shaved that day or even the day before, but he was wearing clean jeans, a shirt, and worn work boots. He wasn't handsome like my husband, but he had what I would call rugged good looks. I thought he was about 35 and reminded me of a young Tom Selleck. I expected him to invite us in or at least show us some hospitality, but this did not happen. The awkward pause in the conversation grew long, but finally, nodding towards the door behind him, where the dogs were still growling threateningly, he said, "I'd invite you in, but my dogs don't really like strangers, and I'm going to have lunch before I get back to work." Not knowing what else to say, Don extended his hand again and said, "Well, it was nice to meet you, Bo. I guess I'll see you around." As we walked back to the road, Don muttered, "Well, I guess that old man Bo isn't coming to our housewarming party." I had to laugh despite my embarrassment. In the months that followed, we only saw one person enter Bo Johnson's house. Once a week or so, we would notice a BMW convertible pull into his driveway. The driver was an attractive red-haired woman in her 40s. Bo came out to help her with her overnight bag, and they briefly hugged, pecking each other on the lips. We assumed she was his old friend because the large mastiff usually accompanied Bo to the car, wagging its stump. She leaned down to scratch his powerful head, and they disappeared into the house. The car would usually sit there the entire next day but disappear the next morning. Sometimes she stayed for 2 days, but no more. Don was confident that the electrical problem was not related to the house itself, since one of the first things he did after purchasing it was to upgrade the old 60-amp system to 200 amps. We were confused by the lack of mobile phone coverage, but we chalked it up to a power outage. We lamented the pitfalls of country life but did outside work that could be done without electricity. Once evening arrived, Dawn cooked chicken on her gas grill and was even able to boil water for rice and frozen vegetables. When darkness fell, there was still no power, and we resigned ourselves to spending the night without air conditioning. Luckily, knowing that we would be living in a rural area and would probably be more susceptible to power outages, we had plenty of candles for just such an occasion. After dark, after finishing dinner, Don said he would drive the truck into town in the morning to get ice if the power wasn't restored. With no TV or other entertainment, we finished the 2 bottles of Chardonnay we had in the fridge and made love. The town was only 10 miles south and consisted of a small independent grocery store, a feed and grain store, gas stations, car repair shops, a dry goods store, a hardware store, and the smallest wooden post office I've ever seen. To do any real shopping, we had to drive 30 miles to Gainesville. When we woke up, there was still no power, and Dawn decided to drive into town to get some needed ice to preserve our food and maybe find out how extensive the problem was. Having to make do without the garage opener, Don got into the pickup, but when he turned the key, nothing happened. Thinking that the problem was with the battery, he tested it and found that it was fully charged. His pickup truck was his pride and joy, and he kept it in perfect condition. So, when he returned to the house from the garage, there was deep bewilderment on his face. We were both completely baffled, trying to imagine the scenario that would leave us without electricity and now without transportation. It was time to contact the electric company to find out when the problem would be resolved, but when I picked up the phone, there was no dialing tone. To add to our worry, neither of our cell phones would activate, even though both should have had sufficient charge. In the morning, nothing had changed, there was still no power, and the truck would not start. To make matters worse, Central Florida is not a great place for summer without air conditioning. Although it was only the beginning of June, the heat was becoming unbearable. Compounding our problems, we no longer had running water. All the homes in this part of the state had individual wells for their water supply, and even though we had added a filter, the water had a strong mineral taste. For this reason, we had at least 4 cases of bottled water stored in the pantry. However, you can't shower with bottled water, but that was the least of our problems. Water shouldn't be wasted flushing the toilet either. As a temporary solution, Dawn removed the toilet seat and attached it to an empty 5-gallon can, but the heat quickly made the urine smell, so the can had to be emptied after each use. That evening, we barbecued in the backyard with all the meat we could find in the refrigerator. We knew this was a temporary solution since the meat would spoil anyway, but it would preserve it a little longer. We then took all our dry food out of the pantry and cupboards and divided it into 2 meals a day. Needless to say, we were not prepared for this eventuality, but we calculated that we had enough food for about 5 to 6 days, hoping that the electricity situation would be resolved. Our street usually had little traffic, but it was the main road into town, so we were used to seeing the occasional car or truck. However, the only vehicle we had seen since the power outage was a tractor heading south. Don was in the backyard when I saw it drive by, but even though I ran out the front door screaming and waving, the driver either didn't notice me or ignored me. We decided to approach our neighbor Bo to see if he could clear things up, but as we approached his house, we heard his 2 large dogs run out from behind, barking and growling. One was a Doberman and the other a huge Mastiff. Both rushed to the front corner of the property as we approached. We stopped, scared that they might attack, but their owner must have had an electric dog fence that taught them to stay off the property because they never crossed the property line. However, we stood still, hoping that our neighbor would come outside to sort out the situation. After 5 full minutes, the dogs were still barking noisily, so we abandoned our mission. We walked to the next closest house, a family farm which was a quarter of a mile in the opposite direction. Although no one bothered us with dogs after we got there, no one answered our insistent knocking, so we returned home. That night, we ate the cooked meat along with a can of green beans and the remains of wilted lettuce. Although the situation wasn't desperate yet, not knowing what was going on was more than a little annoying. I could see the worry on my husband's face despite his occasional attempts to remain cheerful. That night, we discussed our options, and the only conclusion we came to was that we needed to find out what was going on and the extent of the situation. We couldn't just sit idly by while our meager supplies dwindled, hoping for the best. Don figured that if we set off around 6:30 the next morning, we could reach the city by noon. If we didn't meet anyone along the way who could give us answers, we could still be back out of town by 6 o'clock in the evening. When we started our journey just after dawn, we each carried a backpack with several bottles of warm water and a couple of energy bars. By 10 o'clock in the morning, our clothes were soaked with sweat, and we had already used up half of our water supply. Much of the land on the way into town was planted with citrus fruits, and we supplemented our supplies by picking oranges. Lacking a knife, we tore the fruit apart with our hands and then used some of our precious water to clean the sticky juice from our hands and faces. There were no houses along the street we were walking on, just a few farms located in the distance along several dirt roads that crossed our path. Rather than waste precious time and energy approaching them, we decided that the city was our best chance, so we kept going. By 12:30, when we approached the first building in town, we were exhausted. The temperature must have been around 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity was almost tangible. There was no shade on the way into town, and we hadn't thought to apply sunscreen, so both Don and I were starting to feel the effects of sunburn. The old gas station with 2 pumps had a wooden canopy that provided some shade, which we immediately took advantage of. When we got there, the front door was padlocked, and there was no one around. As we sat down against the wall and carefully shared a bottle of water between us, we noticed a small grocery store a few hundred feet ahead. Its front door looked like it had been broken into, the door frame was broken, and the store was completely empty. When we went inside to look around, a few moments later, looking at the completely empty shelves, I heard a small, indistinct sound from the back room. Looking at Don, I realized that he had heard it too because he was looking in that direction. He shouted several times, "Hello." Having received no answer, he pushed the door to enter, but I screamed, and we both jumped to the side in surprise. The orange and white cat ran past our feet and through the open front door. Despite our growing fear, we both couldn't help but laugh at our reaction. Don was on the verge of saying something when we heard it, a rhythmic tapping sound, like a hammer. When we looked out the window, we saw 2 men, more precisely, a man and a teenager, boarding up the windows on the building diagonally across the street with plywood. As we headed towards them, the boy was the first to notice us and nudged the man, nodding his head in our direction. There was a sign above the front door, Chet's Agricultural Products. A stocky man in his 40s, with the reddish face of a farmer, looked at us suspiciously but said nothing when we approached. Instead of extending his hand, my husband stopped a few feet away and said, "Hi, my name is Don Proper, and this is my wife, Carrie. We live about 10 miles north, right here on Liston Road. Do you know what's going on? We lost power a few days ago, our phones aren't working, my car won't start, and we had to walk here. My few neighbors were either not home or didn't answer the door, so we didn't talk to anyone. Without waiting for further introductions, he continued to look at us suspiciously and said, I don't know for sure. Some say it's the Russians, maybe they attacked us, blew up power plants, and things like that. Nobody knows for sure, and we didn't see any police or government officials. Most people left, headed to Gainesville or wherever. Not many cars work, mostly tractors and some old pickups, so most people walk. That seemed to be all he knew, and he turned to go back to his work. When Don insisted, is there somewhere to buy provisions? We are running out of food, the man's head slowly shook. Turning his gaze to the empty market, he said, No, Nate's market sold out 2 days ago. I think he grabbed everything he needed for his family, then locked up the store and headed out of town just after dawn. Some rough guys broke in, they seemed to think there was still something left. I saw them from the top floor, but other than shooting them for breaking the lock, I couldn't do much. My son and I will finish filling up the place, although I'm not sure why, there's nothing useful here yet. Tomorrow at dawn, my wife and I will also leave. I don't know if it will be better, but as they say, there's strength in numbers. In any case, we need to try to do something. With these words, he wished us good luck and returned to his work. Don must have seen the fear and despair on my face because he hugged me and, kissing the top of my head, whispered, We'll be okay. This is the USA, damn it. We just have to hang in there, okay? I nodded, but tears streamed down my dirty cheeks. It was after 7 in the evening when we passed Bo Johnson's house. We could see a faint light at the back of his house, probably candles, but his dogs made their presence known, and we were too weak for it to matter. When we entered the house, the first thing we did was drink a bottle of water. While there was enough light to move around, I kicked off my sweaty shoes and tore off my wet clothes. Because of the heat, I didn't feel like changing, so I put on clean underwear, and Don put on clean boxers. We dined on saltine crackers, peanut butter, and water. By the time darkness enveloped the house, we had already fallen into an exhausted sleep. Over the next 2 days, we saw more and more pilgrims, as we now called them, walking south towards the city. There were families among them, one woman even pushing a stroller. Others were couples, and occasionally singles. By the 6th day, there were fewer travelers. In the afternoon of the 7th day, we found ourselves back in the kitchen, counting our remaining supplies and grimly calculating how many days we could survive. Don set up a water collection system by cutting off the downspout leading from the gutters and installing a 50-gallon plastic drum underneath that had been left in the shed since he bought the house. We hoped that when it rained, we could collect enough water to replace our dwindling supply of bottled water. The roof of the house was metal, so the prospects for purifying water for drinking were better than if it had been covered with tiles. However, water without food would not help us. We had just returned to the kitchen from outside when we heard a roar that could only be a motorcycle. Looking out the window, we saw 2 motorcycles stopped on the road in front of our house. 2 large men sitting on bikes were looking at our house. Both had full beards, sleeveless t-shirts, and arms covered in tattoos. When they turned off their engines and dismounted, it was clear that they were heading for our door. The first to walk was a man with a sweaty bandana on his head and what appeared to be a gun in his hands. Don put his hand on my shoulder and told me to stay inside while he talked to them outside. As Don walked out and closed the door behind him, the 2 menacing-looking thugs came within 10 feet of my husband. They smiled, but their smiles were angry, not friendly. The one who did not hold the gun spoke first. Hey everyone, my buddy and I are looking for some food and water. Give us what you can, and we'll be on our way. How about it, partner? Don was 5 feet 11 inches, but these guys were several inches taller and definitely bigger and rougher than my husband. Don tried not to look scared as he answered, I don't have food. I went to the forest to pick berries, and I collect water from the roof when it rains. Sorry, guys, but I can't help. They looked at each other and laughed. Then the one holding the gun growled, Well, you. We'll just take a look for ourselves. When Don stood in front of him to block his path, the guy hit him on the side of the head with the butt of his gun. Don fell to his knees, holding his head. I screamed and ran outside, kneeling next to him. "You an idiots!" I hissed. "Why did you do this?" "My husband told you the truth. We have no food." As Don tried to get up, the one who wasn't holding the gun hit him in the chest, and he fell, groaning in pain. The guy with the gun grabbed me by the hair and, turning to his comrade, laughed and said, "We might not get food, but we'll definitely have some fun." As he pulled me to my feet, I tried to scratch his arms and face. Suddenly, a red mist enveloped his head, his eyes widened in shock for a moment, and he fell, letting go of my hair and collapsing to the ground. Scared and not understanding what was happening, I found myself on my hands and knees. The second biker began to slowly retreat, looking around, trying to understand what had happened. He suddenly stopped, and I saw his eyes go to the gun. As he started to move forward to pick it up, I heard another loud bang, and his head exploded too. I crawled over to my husband and tried to help him get up. He writhed in pain, standing on his feet and holding his ribs. I saw a wound on my forehead near my hairline. When I tried to hug him, he groaned in pain, so I held his arm to help steady him on his feet and guide him into the house. I shuddered, feeling someone's presence to the right. Bo Johnson walked towards us with a military rifle slung over his shoulder. Calmly and authoritatively, he said, "Let's take him to me. I have the medical supplies we'll need to treat him." With that, he handed me his rifle to carry and placed Don's hand on his shoulder as we walked slowly towards his house. Surprisingly, the rifle was not that big or heavy, the sight on the top was almost as long as the gun itself. As soon as we walked in, Bo laid Don down on the couch and told me to go into the kitchen and wet the towels that were sitting by the sink next to a full 5-gallon cooler water bottle. "Try to clean him up," he said. "When I return, I'll grab my first aid kit, and we'll see what we can do." "It's not as bad as it looks," Bo said. "You're going to need a few stitches, Donnie. You need to stop the bleeding, and it's going to hurt like hell." He took a syringe from his bag and inserted it into a small vial, drawing out a clear liquid. He did it the way they do in war films. Don asked him what he was doing, and Bo simply replied, "Morphine. It won't knock you out, but it will help with the soreness." With these words, he injected it into Don's arm. While the morphine was taking effect, Bo Johnson was busy sewing with surgical thread. When he was finished, he cleaned the area with alcohol and treated the skin around the wound with freezing spray. Up until this point, I had been brave, but I couldn't bring myself to watch the process. I heard Don cry out in pain several times, but I still couldn't watch. "Okay, Donnie, just 2 more stitches, and we'll look at those ribs," I heard Bo say. He then checked Don's ribs. "Nothing's broken. Maybe a couple of cracks, but either way, you'll be sore for a few days, so take care of yourself here for a bit." "I've got things to do," he stated and walked out the front door. A short time later, I heard a motorcycle starting and then the sound of the engine moving away along the side of the house and into the backyard. A few minutes later, I heard the second bike repeat the process. When I looked out the back window, I didn't see any motorcycles, but I saw Bo digging a hole near the fence. I returned to the living room to check on my husband. Don was in a lot of pain between his head wound and his ribs, but the morphine lulled him enough to nod off on the couch. My adrenaline rush was subsiding, and sitting next to Don, my body began to shake as memories of the 2 bikers and what they were going to do to me and my husband filled my mind. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't control my crying. When I finally calmed down, Don was already awake. I didn't even feel him take my hand, and the surprise on his face as he looked at the ceiling made me wonder if his head injury was more serious than it seemed. Still looking at the ceiling, he simply said, "Look." When I looked up, I immediately understood why he was so fascinated. The ceiling fan was spinning at half speed. The second thing I realized was that, although the house was warm, it was not the steamy room we had been enduring for the past week. I looked at Don with bewilderment, and reaching for the table lamp, I turned it on. It immediately lit up. "Oh my God, honey, the power is back!" I exclaimed in delight. "Sorry to disappoint you," said a voice from the doorway. "The electricity has not returned and will not return anytime soon. I have a generator in the back. I use it sparingly to make living conditions acceptable." With these words, he walked over and turned off the lamp. "What do you mean the power won't come back?" Don asked, concern in his voice. Although Don asked the question, Bo looked directly at me as he answered, "You have no idea what's going on, do you? You can bet your farm it was an EMP attack." Seeing our bewilderment, he continued, "EMP stands for electromagnetic pulse. One of our enemies, who knows, Russia, China, Iran, one of them, did it. They detonated a nuclear device thousands of feet above us. Instead of killing us directly, they decided they would let us die naturally. And if they don't kill us all, it will practically exclude us from the civilized world. The impulse created by the explosion has knocked out our power grid. With no electricity, no fuel, no food, no sanitation system, and no government, we're in a bad situation. Our government has known about this for decades," he added. "Not just the possibility but the likelihood. Scientists and even a few honest politicians have testified before congressional committees many times. Damn politicians. All they care about is their lifetime salaries and re-election. They don't care about voters." "If you're right," Don interrupted, "what could we do?" "They could strengthen the grid. Russia did it. China did it. They made their power grids virtually impervious to attack. We don't. We spend billions on foreign aid to countries that hate us and billions on stupid social programs that repeatedly fail. And now we're in the..." I still wasn't convinced this wasn't right-wing, so I asked, "What's going to happen now? Is everyone just going to die of starvation or disease?" "Millions will die, maybe more," Bo said. "It's hard to say. People who wrote about it estimate that up to 100 million could die without a significant military presence, without police, and without communications. Anarchy will set in. Hungry people will abandon civilized behavior when there is no civilization as such, and they see their children dying of hunger and disease. Crap, you saw what could happen just a few hours ago. These drags of society were scum to begin with, and they would take what they wanted and probably kill you just for fun. So if you feel any guilt, don't. Someone should have rid society of such scum and their ilk long ago. The problem is that very soon it will be the law of the jungle, survival of the fittest. People like you will simply be forgotten as random victims." "Thank you," I said sarcastically. "So, you're one of the strongest, Mr. Johnson, I guess." "Time will tell," he replied. "But I certainly haven't been sitting around waiting for Uncle Sam to come save me. Yes, I'm pretty self-sufficient, at least for now. Now, Mrs. Mars proper, I would ask Donnie here to help me, but he won't be useful for a while. So I need your help in the yard." "What do you need me to do?" I asked suspiciously. "Bodies," he said. "I would prefer if their corpses were just left lying around, but there are sanitation issues. Besides, there will likely be more refugees, and we don't need to draw too much attention to ourselves." I was shocked at the thought of even approaching them and expressed my reluctance. Bo said categorically, "If you want to eat tonight, you'll help. All I need is for you to lift their legs so I can load them into the wheelbarrow without tipping over. They're big guys, so we'll have to do it one at a time." Don tried to get up but groaned in pain. "I'll do it." "She doesn't have to." When he stood up, he was overcome with dizziness and pain and had difficulty sitting back down. Bo walked out the door, and without saying a word, I followed. Later that day, after he had buried the bodies, this stern man who had hardly spoken to us for 6 months said, "Stay for dinner, and then we'll talk." I was so hungry that I felt nauseous and dizzy. Don was still feeling the effects of the morphine, but they were starting to wear off, and I could see the discomfort showing on his face. At first, he didn't want to eat. I didn't know whether it was out of pride or suspicion, but I forced him to sit at the table. When I sat Don down at the table, Bo was still outside. "Be careful, Carrie," Bo said quietly. "Nothing is free in this world. Beware of Greeks bearing gifts and all that." "I know, darling, but we're starving right now. So let's see how things work out. We don't have anything to offer, and besides, he probably did save us today. Let's just see what happens. He'll probably just kick us out after dinner." Dinner consisted of boiled rabbit, onions, carrots, and potatoes, which he cooked in a large cauldron on a makeshift grill that he had built from some kind of steel container. When he pulled out what looked like skim milk from the refrigerator, I was amazed. He must have noticed my gaze because he casually remarked, "I only run the generator long enough to keep my meat and milk from spoiling. It's just watered-down goat's milk, but it's nutritious, and you can get used to it." Don didn't eat much, but for me, it was a feast in a 5-star restaurant. Bo must have even added some spices to the pot because the stew was delicious. When he saw that we had finished the goat's milk, he took a jug of water from the refrigerator. The water was cool, but compared to the hot water we'd been drinking, it was like champagne. After dinner, Bo got down to business. He started asking direct questions. When he talked to us, he always looked at me, rarely at my husband. There was nothing lustful in his gaze, but he acted as if I was making the decisions. I knew this was annoying Don, but at that moment, I had nothing to say. This man saved our lives and, at least, saved me from being attacked. Now we sat here eating his food, and although I felt uneasy, I remained silent. "I assume your food and water supplies are running low?" he asked. I nodded and then added, "We have some crackers and canned goods, enough to last a few days if we're careful." Don came up with something to collect rainwater in a big barrel, and we already have quite a bit saved up. I knew it sounded weak, but I wanted to show that my husband was doing everything he could to help us survive. "Do you have any weapons or ammunition?" Bo asked. Don shook his head and then, for some reason, added, "We have never supported gun rights. It's just not part of our value system." Bo looked at him with confusion written all over his face, and to be honest, I was taken aback by Don's statement. This was not the time or place to speak out about gun ownership or gun owners. "Yeah, well, if it weren't for the guns, you'd be speaking German by now. If it weren't for the guns, you'd probably be dead, and those scum would have taken what they wanted and probably killed you for fun. If only it weren't for weapons, you wouldn't be sitting here enjoying rabbit stew." Bo was clearly annoyed by Don's response, and it showed in his sarcastic reply. I tried to soften the situation by adding, "We understand that guns are a necessary evil. We just don't think everyone should have the right to have one. We're from the city, Mr. Johnson, and we just never realized how important guns are to people like you." As soon as I said this, I realized that I had made a mistake. The situation was getting worse, and I was frustrated that Don was leading us down this path. Bo let out a sarcastic laugh and replied, "People like me? You mean good old boys like me, uneducated rednecks who cling to their Bibles and guns?" I was stunned, and I'm sure the blush on my cheeks confirmed it. He never took his eyes off me, waiting for my next mistake. No, Mr. Johnson, I'm sorry. That came out wrong. This has been a very hard day for us, and I apologize for any accidental offense. Thanks for the help and for the dinner, but maybe we should go." Both Don and I started to rise, but Bo sighed with irony and said, "Go where? Home? You have no food to speak of, you have no way to defend yourself. You think these two thugs will be the last ones to try to rob you of food or anything else they want? And when the food runs out, what will you do? Just sit and wait for death?" I slowly sank back into the chair, and Don was still standing, holding the back of the chair, not knowing whether to stay or go. I knew our host was right. Unless a miracle happened, we would both die in a week or two, and the thought of such a painful end was looming before me. I saw from Don's look that he also realized our inevitable fate, so he asked with suspicion in his voice, "What are you suggesting, Mr. Johnson?" "We don't have many options," Bo said. "For now, I suggest you sit back until I call the dogs to feed. They are much nicer to people who are not a threat, and a sitting position is less threatening. They'll both sniff you for a while, and Patty, the Doberman, may growl a little, but as long as I'm here, she won't bite. Elvis, the big guy, is really a sweetheart. He just needs to get acquainted, so to speak. You won't be able to leave in this state, wandering around in the dark, so I suggest that after the beasts realize you're supposed to be here, you stay the night in one of the guest rooms upstairs, and we'll talk in the morning." After we met the dogs, Bo gave me a couple of pills and, again without addressing Don directly, said, "It's Tylenol with codeine. It will ease the pain and help him sleep." I noticed that Mr. Johnson's rough, rustic manner of speaking faded in and out at will. Honestly, after the events of the day, I was afraid to go home and was grateful when my husband agreed to stay, at least for one night. The surreal memories of the day's events kept me up all night, but the pills must have worked on Don because he could barely move. The sun did not wake me, and for a moment, I felt disoriented being in a strange bed with unfamiliar surroundings. The day was cloudy, and light rain pattered on the tin roof. When I looked at Don, he was already fully conscious, looking at the ceiling, apparently deep in thought. When he looked at me, there was sadness in his eyes. "I believe everything Johnson said last night," he said. "It's not just a power outage, it could be the end of the world. Remember that Denzel Washington movie, The Book of Eli? Yeah, that's what it's like. Unlike him, we have no direction, no weapons, no skills to use them even if we had them. I don't expect Johnson's hospitality to last long. For the first time in my life, I don't know what to do. I feel like I've let you down. There's nothing you could do." "Nothing we could do," I said, reaching for his hand. Before I could add more, he continued furiously, "Yes, we could. I remember reading a newspaper article a while ago that mentioned this possibility, but I dismissed it as some crazy right-wing conspiracy, so I didn't even read the rest of the article. If I had been more sober and less judgmental, I would have done a little research, and maybe we wouldn't be in this situation." "Darling," I answered sincerely, "it's not your fault. No one could have predicted this." "No one?" Johnson said with a hint of bitterness. "That guy in the article, too. And I'd bet a lot of other people pulled their heads out of their complacent asses before it was too late." Don seemed almost desperate as we got dressed the next morning to face whatever future we still had left. "Late risers," Bo said with a friendly grin as we entered the kitchen. "Well, the weather put a bit of a damper on my plans, but God knows we need water, so I delayed breakfast for you." "Eggs and bacon," he said nonchalantly. "The bacon is wild, not as well cured as I would like, but you can get used to it." I was too startled to speak when Bo came out the back door with a tray of food. He had built a canopy from which he could cook over the grill to stay dry and protect the fire from the weather. We ate in silence, and despite the rather strong taste of the meat, Don and I ate it as if it were our last supper, which might have been true. We had just finished eating when the dog started barking furiously outside. Bo seemed to understand what was happening as he grabbed his rifle, which was lying next to the back door, and walked outside. We followed him a moment later, and Bo was already about 50 yards ahead of us, heading toward the wire fence on the south side of his property. The dogs barked so loudly that at first, I did not notice the man standing frozen in fear just beyond this side of the fence. Strangely, the dogs kept a respectful distance from their prey, but when Bo shouted, "Patty, go," the Doberman lunged at the man, and I saw him fall to the ground with the dog on top. At that moment, I heard screams, but not from the man on the ground. It was the screams of two people on the other side of the fence, a man and a woman, shouting words that were indistinguishable from where Don and I stopped. Bo fired into the air, and the dog took a few steps away from its victim. Bo continued to walk toward them, all the while still quite far away when the man rose to his feet, holding his leg, and limped back to the fence line. He slid under the fence, and the woman dropped to her knees, apparently to attend to his wound. Another shot rang out, and the frightened intruders looked in our direction. Bo shouted, "Get out of here, do you hear? We have nothing for you. If you return, I will not recall the dogs." As they stumbled off into the woods, I realized Don had a firm grip on my shoulder, and I was shaking. It was raining lightly as we returned to the kitchen, Bo soon following us. "They probably just wanted to eat," I said accusingly. "Yes, that's probably true." "So, what was I supposed to do? Take them in, feed them, and then expect them to leave when they're full? Do you think they would just leave with nowhere to go? Or those two men would be so desperate to try to eliminate me, and at this point, that means us. What about the next ones that come? Should I feed them too? Maybe offer them a room and just hope they don't kill me in the middle of the night? Maybe you'd like to give them your dinner?" At that moment, I realized two things. Firstly, we would be fed again, and secondly, he was right. I didn't want to lose my chance of survival, and those strangers posed a threat to that possible survival. I realized one more thing. I was tired of my husband's silence. He seemed to be an observer of everything that happened, almost never expressing his opinion. Maybe he was waiting to see the chips fall, but it was getting annoying. Bo never addressed him directly, and it felt like I was speaking for both of us, which I didn't like. Bo was still looking at me, waiting for an answer, but my thoughts were elsewhere. As I looked up with downcast eyes, I just shook my head slightly, acknowledging the truth of his words. Finally, my husband spoke and asked, "Mr. Johnson?" "Bo, call me Bo," Bo said. This was the first time Bo addressed him as anything other than Donnie, a name my husband hated. "Okay, Bo," Don continued. "We appreciate your hospitality, but it seems we're just delaying the inevitable. I'm sure you can't feed us indefinitely, and eventually, we'll have to go home and await our fate." "You're right, Don. There are no free lunches here," Bo said. "But I have a proposal that could solve our common problems. Let's go into the living room and see if we can come to an agreement." Again, Bo lost his simple manner and, with a serious, businesslike expression on his face, led us into the front room. Dawn and I sat on the sofa, and our host took the leather chair across from us. He seemed somewhat worried as he was obviously formulating his words. Finally, speaking and looking straight at Don, he began, "You asked how long I could feed you." "Well, the answer is simple," Bo said. "Unless there is a natural or non-natural disaster, I can manage for quite some time. A natural disaster, such as a major hurricane, could seriously disrupt, if not destroy, my goal of complete independence. A non-natural disaster, such as an organized invasion by marauders, would spell the end. The latter is more likely than the former." Don intervened hastily. "We have over $5,000 in cash, plus gold and diamond jewelry worth several thousand." Don's intentions were clear. He offered all our assets in exchange for the opportunity to receive shelter and food. Bo's response was sincere and devoid of the irony I expected. "Don, I don't need your money or your jewelry. Even if you had $1 million under your mattress, I still wouldn't want it. How would that benefit me? There are no shops, no banks, and no stock market. Money is of no use unless you can leave the country alive. Even then, the US dollar will probably be worth as much as Confederate money very soon. The only thing that can be useful here, or anywhere else, is barter. Here in the wilderness, we still rely on barter for most of our goods and services. Let me tell you, Lyle Butler, who lives down the road, raises chickens, so he'll give Bobby Thorough, who lives on Bender Street, a few dozen eggs and a couple of chickens to fix some equipment for him. In addition to his mechanical skills, Bobby makes excellent whiskey and trades it for Floyd Linder's quarter of beef. I think you understand what I mean. We help each other and, at the same time, try to keep the government's hands out of our pockets as much as possible. So I won't beat around the bush. You have what I need and want, and I have what you need and want. I propose we negotiate so that we both get what we need." He paused for effect, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I'm sure you've seen Gail, my friend who comes to see me from time to time. She was probably already an ex by this point, a trophy wife for a guy who was 20 years older than her. He was often away on business, and his only requirement was that she be discreet and be there for him when he was home. Well, hell," he said with a laugh, "you can't be more discreet than in this one-horse town. I met her when I went to Jacksonville a couple of years ago to close a deal on land next door to mine. She worked for a property management company, and I invited her to lunch. Lunch turned into something more. Well, you get the point. It was a mutually beneficial relationship, no commitment, no romance, just two people satisfying each other's needs." Bo looked straight at me as he said this, and I was pretty sure where the conversation was going. I was also sure that the color of my cheeks betrayed my understanding. Strangely, I was more curious than outraged. I knew full well that without Bo's help, my husband and I were doomed. However, I was too embarrassed to even look in my husband's direction, so I continued to look at Bo. "I'm pretty self-sufficient here," Bo continued. "There's a lake about a half-mile behind the state that provides water and some fish. I hunt deer and wild pigs, which provides meat. I have chickens and goats, and like you, I grow a large vegetable garden. But I only have 2 hands, and taking care of all this leaves little time to do everything necessary to ensure complete independence. I bought a wind turbine a while ago, but the county wouldn't give me permission to install it. Now there's no one in the area, but building one is a task for at least 2 people. I can keep the house in tolerable condition with limited use of the generator, but my gasoline and propane don't last forever. The roof of the shed is in bad shape, and a storm is good enough to finish it off, so some fences need to be reinforced, especially in areas that make the property more vulnerable to intruders. I need to build a greenhouse from stock, wood, and polypropylene. I need to build an irrigation system to water the garden. There are other items on my to-do list, but you get the idea. So you see, Bo concluded, there are things that you both can suggest to make this place more like a commune and not just a fortress. Don finally spoke cautiously. You said there are things that we both can offer, but before that, you talked about your relationship with a married woman based on mutual benefit. It seems you are not being completely honest. It seems to me that I will not be mistaken in assuming that you are looking for more than just a housekeeper and hired worker. You're right, Bo said, looking straight at Don. Understand, these are unusual times. These are desperate times. Society and social norms no longer exist for us. Believe me, it will only get worse before it gets better. When I say better, I don't mean going back to what was normal before. Those days are gone forever. I could wait until another desperate couple came along and make them the same offer I made to you. They would have little choice but to accept it or perish. Everything in life is a quid pro quo. I provide eggs to Tom McDonald from the road, and he gives me lemons and oranges from his citrus farm. All goods are now worth their weight in gold, if they are available at all. Turning to me but still talking to Don, he continued, put yourself in my shoes. Imagine that this is your house, Dawn, and that my beautiful wife and I live next door. We come to you in desperation. Imagine that you shelter us and provide for our needs, but every night you go to bed alone while my wife and I share each other's bodies. How long do you think it will be before your jealousy and primal needs distort your judgment? How soon will you decide that you are not being fairly compensated for your contributions? Perhaps you'll end up trying to win her affections and take her away from me, or if that fails, just remove me from the equation. So you want me to sell myself for a chance at survival? I said quite frankly. No, Bo said decisively. You are not an easy girl, and I would never treat you as one. I suggest that you sleep with me in my bed a couple of nights a week. I will treat you and Dawn with respect. I will not compete for your love, and other than these planned evenings, I will not intrude on your marriage. Looking back at my husband, he continued, I will never cuckold you, no grins, no jokes, no hints. This is a routine born out of necessity, and the goal is our mutual survival. I would never do anything to hurt or humiliate Carrie. Although I understand that this proposal may seem like a bitter pill, at least at first, my expectation is that over time, this will become a normal way of life in the abnormal world we now live in. I looked at my husband with anxiety, not knowing what his reaction would be. Don was not violent, but that didn't mean he was a coward. Any man could be driven to violence. However, Don sat thoughtfully, staring at the architect of this unusual marriage proposal. I wasn't surprised that my husband didn't physically attack Bo, but I was disappointed that he didn't at least confront him verbally. Instead of the expected indignation, he simply asked, what if Carrie and I don't agree to this arrangement? Bo looked at me with confusion, but I looked away. I felt like a pawn in a chess game, a sacrificial lamb. I said, you saw how many people passed by. Eventually, another suitable couple will come along and accept the chance to survive. But I sincerely hope that you will seriously consider this offer. I like both of you, and I think that over time, we could become a productive and effective team. But to answer your question, Don, if you decide to back out, I will make you the same offer I would have made if you had accepted at first and then decided it didn't work for you. I keep a supply of those emergency food bags they advertise on TV. I will give each of you enough for 60 days, and what you do after that will no longer be my business. However, let me reiterate that there is no escape. Cities along the East Coast are completely destroyed, no water, no food, no sewage. People kill and abuse their fellow citizens, and very few receive even a formal burial. The rat population is out of control, and diseases are starting to appear even at this early stage. Those strong and ruthless enough to survive so far migrate to the suburbs in hopes of salvation. There were reports of a few scattered attempts to organize small militias of neighbors for protection, but ultimately, they would either be crushed or simply die from their lack of preparedness. In Florida, Everyone has a gun, well, almost everyone, he said, looking at both of us. So one can imagine a massacre when desperate, untrained people start shooting at each other. It's survival of the fittest, and eventually, the survivors will begin to move into the countryside where they assume there will be clean water and game to hunt. How do you know all this? I asked with suspicion. We don't have television, radio, or even newspapers, so these are all the predictions of some apocalypse theorists. Well, actually, I wish these were just theories. Then maybe we could retain some hope, Bo said. If you look at the roof of my barn, you will notice the antenna for my radio. We conspiracy theorists, as I put it, set up the network a long time ago. Every day at noon, I turn on the power to go live and get the latest news broadcast across the network. What I have told you is a summary of what I have heard from various radio amateurs. Bo seemed a little annoyed as he resumed the conversation. So I suggest you stay the night and discuss this. But tomorrow morning, I will want to hear your answer. He got up to leave when we heard the sounds of barking and growling from the north side of the house where our house was located. Bo grabbed his rifle and took a quick look out the window before opening the door. When we followed him outside, 2 men were walking out of our house, carrying a couple of our cloth shopping bags and our last case of bottled water. Bo shouted at them to stop, but as they began to run, one of the men carrying only one package turned around, still running backward, and fired his pistol 2 or 3 times in our direction. Don threw me to the ground as the man turned around and continued running. Bo fired once, and the man fell to the ground, clutching his leg. His partner dropped his bags and returned to help his friend. Together, they limped away down the road. I expected Bo to shoot again and kill them both, like he did with the bikers, but he just stood there and watched until they were almost out of sight. At Bo's suggestion, we collected our abandoned supplies and returned them to his house before dinner. That day, Don returned to our house to assess the damage the intruders might have done. While he was there, I asked Bo why he didn't kill the 2 men like he did with the bikers. He was chopping some meat on the kitchen counter. After looking at me briefly, he shrugged his shoulders and replied, "Those other animals were going to take you by force, possibly torture you, and definitely kill you." These guys acted out of desperation. The shots they fired were out of fear, and I wounded one so they knew better than to come back here again. There will no doubt be others, but that's a bridge we have yet to cross. After dinner, mostly eaten in silence, the heat and humidity became unbearable. Our host turned on the generator to let the fans and air conditioning cool the house down a bit. When it began to get dark, he lit several candles and reminded us to put them out before going to bed. He went to his bedroom, which was located next to the living room. The room was his office, but for security reasons, he had turned it into a bedroom, not wanting to be upstairs in case of trouble. Both dogs stayed in the house overnight. They quickly got used to our presence and mostly ignored us. Don and I sat in silence, both avoiding the elephant in the room that we knew we would have to discuss. Finally, I broke the silence and said quietly, "Let's go upstairs where we can talk." Don just nodded and stood up tiredly, blowing out all the candles except one, which we used to find our way up. At Bo's insistence, the bedroom curtains were kept closed at night to prevent light from attracting unwanted attention. On the top floor, there were 3 bedrooms and a bathroom with a window overlooking the courtyard on the shady side. We took the candle into the bathroom to prepare for bed and the inevitable conversation that would follow. Don sat down heavily on the chair in the bedroom, and I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to look at him. He looked at the floor, clearly unable or unwilling to speak. I felt bad for him, knowing what internal chaos was eating away at him. However, I knew that we were between a rock and a hard place, and not discussing this was not an option. "Dear," I said, reaching out to take his hand, "please talk to me. What do you think?" His expression changed to one of extreme anger as he looked up at me and growled, "I think Bo Johnson is a sneaky man, that's what I think. I think he is a devious liar pretending to be a stupid hillbilly, then shedding his sheep's clothing and making us an unacceptable offer to satisfy his lust. What kind of marriage will we have if you have to sleep with this idiot? What kind of man allows another man to have his wife?" He gently pulled back his hand and repeated, "What man?" "Carrie, what man?" "The one who loves her," I said quietly. "Someone who knows we have no choice if we want to survive. Someone who knows that she may give him her body from time to time, but she will never give him her heart. So when he has a night with you, will you think about me? He asked sarcastically. Damn, Don, this isn't fair. Do you think I like it? Do you know how humiliating it is to feel like an object or an inflatable doll? I can't imagine how you feel, but try to think about how I feel. Our safe, comfortable world has disappeared. We don't know what tomorrow will bring, or next week, or next year. We don't know how much we have left on this earth. But we do what we have to do to survive and pray that in time this nightmare will end. Without further discussion, Dawn finally went to bed. We eventually made love, but I doubt we slept much, knowing that tomorrow we would have to face a new reality. We tried to hug afterward, but it was too hot, and I ended up just lying on my back, covered in sweat and completely without anything. I had a lot more intimate experience than Dawn when we got married, but since the first time I was with him, I had not been with another man or even thought about it. I couldn't help but wonder what it would be like or how I would feel when Beau was with me. Would he simply use my flesh to satisfy his needs? Would he force me to satisfy him? Would I be able to remain emotionally faithful to my husband and not become an intim aroused while he used my body? How often would I be required to meet his needs? How could I maintain a loving relationship with my husband knowing that he was aware of my relationship with another person? Would Don ask me to tell him the details of our intimacy, and what would I tell him? Eventually, the thoughts and questions that filled my mind melted away into sleep. I woke up when Dawn lifted the curtain, allowing sunlight to flood the room. We got dressed in silence and went down to the kitchen. I heard the sound of a hammer at the back of the shed and noticed a letter addressed to us on the table. It started like this. Carrie and Dawn. There is breakfast in the refrigerator, and the coffee should still be hot. I'll be working in the backyard until noon, when I turn on the radio. It seemed to me that it would be less awkward to put my proposal in writing than to suffer the possible embarrassment of a personal meeting. If you're not happy with the conditions, I left the bags of food I promised in boxes by the front door, along with the remaining supplies and water you took from the intruders. If you decide to leave when I return, I will understand and wish you luck. All the pretense of the uneducated hillbilly disappeared as his letter continued. Obviously, this is not a formal contract, and neither of you are serfs, so you can leave at any time. Although you only have my word, I promise to uphold my end of the bargain. Dawn will work with me to share the labor that many planned projects require. I suggest that you remove any personal items that are valuable to you from your home and move them here. We can barricade the windows and doors of your home with plenty of plywood that I have, which will help deter looters and keep the home somewhat intact for possible future use. Along with housework, Carrie will learn how to tend vegetable gardens, care for chickens, manage an incubator, and feed and milk goats. Both of you will learn to use my weapons well enough to increase the security of our farm commune. My goal and hope are that we can create an atmosphere of mutual respect and cooperation despite the chaos from which it was born. This is a completely new world without laws and morals. We will be the ones who set the rules by which we try to survive. As for this new world order, Carrie will be sleeping in my bedroom every fourth night starting this Saturday. I recognize that this is a radical departure from the social norms to which we are accustomed, but that society no longer exists, and the alternatives are much worse. Today was Wednesday, so if we decide to accept the offer, we will only have 2 days to try to adjust to our new world order. Now my task is to convince my husband that, under the given circumstances, the conditions are fair and, most importantly, that this will not affect my love for him. I knew Don's burden was much heavier than mine. Beau Johnson was a strong, handsome man, so it wasn't like I had to submit to a creep. However, Don was a proud man, and his self-esteem was at stake, so I did everything I could to preserve his self-esteem. When Beau came back through the back door around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, wiping the sweat from his brow, he was completely at ease when he spoke. Damn, it's hot outside. Carrie, could you make us lunch? There is chicken and salad in the refrigerator. I don't have mayonnaise, but I found that vegetable oil is a pretty good substitute for making chicken salad. I'm going to wash my face and turn on the electricity for a couple of hours. After lunch, we can go to your house and pick up everything you need so you can settle down here for the rest of the day. I said okay and didn't just nod. On Friday morning, while Dawn began digging the foundation for the wind turbine that would support the 75-foot steel tower, Beau gave me my first lesson in chicken care and the process of selecting an incubator. Several times that day, I heard Patty and Elvis barking furiously. Looking out the window of the front room, I saw the refugees, whom we now called that, walking south. One such disheveled group was a family of 4 with a boy and a girl who appeared to be around 14 and 12 years old, respectively. Although the dogs stayed close to them along the fence line, they stopped briefly to look in our direction. But the man's attempt to step into the territory was met with a growl from the Doberman, who almost grabbed his leg. Eventually, they left. That night, as the 3 of us were sharing half of the cooked chicken, Swiss chard, and curry with rice, I mentioned to Bo about the family I had seen earlier in the day and asked, couldn't we at least offer them some water and some crumbs of baby food? Bo leaned back in his chair and put down his fork with an audible sigh. His expression did not show irritation but rather resembled that of a parent whose child does not understand the meaning of his words. With a slight shake of his head and in a soft but firm tone, he said, Carrie, we can't be the Salvation Army or the Red Cross. It would be cruel rather than humane to delay the inevitable by offering a few bites of food and then telling them to go on their way. We cannot save the world, and trying to do so would cost us our survival. From what I have heard, it is estimated that thousands, if not tens of thousands, are dying every day. Millions will follow them, and there is nothing we can do about it. He was right, of course. It would be cruel to offer what were essentially crumbs to hungry people just to delay their inevitable fate. But it gnawed at my soul. I was awakened by an explosion on Saturday morning that I thought might have been a gunshot. When I turned around, Dawn was not in bed, and my heart began to pound. I quickly sat up and heard the loud sound of rain hitting the windows and metal roof. A flash of light illuminated the room, followed by a loud clap of thunder. Before Dawn entered the room, it was already morning, and he lifted the curtain before entering the bathroom. The morning light was obscured by dark storm clouds as the lightning and thunder continued. Today was Saturday, and the fact that I would not sleep in this bed the following night was always on my mind, and I believe it was never far from my husband's thoughts either. When Don gently pushed me back onto the pillow and slid without clothes next to me under the sheet, he whispered, "There's not much to do in this weather. We must take advantage of it." He kissed me deeply, and we had passionate night. The downpour continued until almost 1 o'clock in the afternoon. During this time, Bo remained mostly in his room, forgetting that he was here. I went into the living room and noticed movement in his temporary bedroom. I saw Bo sitting at the table, his back to the open door. He alternated between writing or drawing on a legal pad and referring to the open book next to him. He seemed completely unaware of my presence as I quietly watched him. He was without anything from the waist up, and his broad shoulders and muscular back were bent slightly forward as he worked. To my shame, I briefly wondered what it would be like tonight when I had to sleep with him. After all, I reasoned, Don wasn't the first, and I wasn't in love with those who came before him. They were simply filling a need. I would fill the same need for Bo Johnson. Before meeting Don, I dated men quite often. I wasn't looking for a husband per se, but if the right person came along, it wouldn't be out of the question. I've always had a fairly active libido, and although I've been with a few men I dated, it was only after we got to know each other a little. Even then, it was more like a fitness test. After all, I wouldn't buy a pair of shoes without trying them on. Plus, I had Marty to satisfy my carnal desires. I met Marty at a club one evening when I went out with a few friends after work. He was what most women would describe as hunky, 190 centimeters tall, weighing about 86 kilograms, with long dirty blonde hair and dreamy light blue eyes. We danced a lot, had several drinks throughout the evening, and there was an immediate intimately spark between us. We ended the night passionately kissing in his car, and although we didn't make love that night, we came very close. By the end of our second date, I knew Marty wasn't marriage material, but I loved his magnetic personality and sarcastic humor. He did not try to woo me with flowery rhetoric or convince me of the nobility of his intentions. He was one of those men who could say something that would get others slapped, but instead, he made me laugh with his explicit comments and night innuendos. He also turned me on a lot. Over the next year and a half, we used each other for bodily needs, both realizing that we meant little to each other. We met 2 or 3 times a month whenever it was convenient for us. I never told Don about Marty or our unusual relationship. Before boarding up our old home, we took everything we wanted from there, all our things, linen, items with sentimental value, and 2 boxes of books and magazines. These were the books Don was reading at the kitchen table when I walked into the room. Beau had quite a lot of reading material, but it was mostly historical military novels, ranging from the Revolutionary War to biographies of various generals or technical manuals. We talked casually while I prepared another rabbit dinner. Beau had a lot of cookbooks on game recipes, so I used them to prepare the meal. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Beau appeared at the door, carrying his assault rifle and wearing a pistol holster on his hip. When he turned to Don, he was very friendly. "Hey Don, what do you say we go out in the backyard, and I'll show you how to use this gun?" After all, he added with a touch of irony, "if something happens to me, you'll have to know how to protect yourself." The irony was obvious, considering that he was teaching the man whose wife he was about to take to bed how to use a gun. Either Beau had a lot of confidence in Don's moral integrity, or he was suicidal. I thought my first attempt at rabbit stew was acceptable at best, but both men exclaimed how wonderful it was. Maybe I just wasn't in the mood for rabbit stew, but it's more likely that the dilemma before me was suppressing my appetite because I ate so little. Beau had previously started the generator to cool the house and provide hot water for washing dishes and quick showers. After the kitchen was cleaned and the dishes washed, Beau retired to his room, presumably to work on calculations for how to pump water from the lake into the house once the wind turbine was up and running. Don and I stayed in the kitchen, drinking coffee, but the conversation was awkward, and nothing was said about the upcoming night's arrangement. As the sun began to set, Don said he would go take a shower while the water was still warm. Beau had a large solar panel on the roof to heat the water, but at this time of year in the south, the scorching sun was enough to keep the water consistently warm. Beau even installed a temporary shower curtain, probably for my convenience. When he returned from the shower, Don walked upstairs silently. After I heard our bedroom door close, I went to the bathroom to brush my teeth and comb my hair. I couldn't bring myself to go into the bedroom to grab my nightgown or robe, but I took my toothbrush and comb with me. When I came back downstairs, Beau, to my surprise, was sitting on the couch in shorts and a t-shirt. He waved his hand at me, inviting me to sit next to him. I nervously sat on the edge of the sofa, looking at my fingers. Beau put his hand on my shoulder and gently pushed me back, saying quietly, "Carrie, I understand that this will be difficult at first, especially for Don. But I hope that over time he will see the practicality of this arrangement. At the same time, I will try to make our time together as comfortable and enjoyable as possible." I tried to smile when I finally brought myself to look at him, but I'm sure it looked as forced as it felt. My mouth was so dry that I could barely swallow, and my knees felt so weak that I was afraid I wouldn't be able to stand. He stood up and, looking at me, extended his hand. When I took it, he carefully lifted me to my feet, blew out the candles, and led me to his bedroom. There was one small candle burning on his large antique chest of drawers, on which stood a jug of water. He asked if I was thirsty as I sat nervously on the edge of his bed. I just nodded. Over the past few days, I had been thinking about how I would handle this when the time came. I decided that I would offer Beau night as formally as possible. I would remain emotionally faithful to my husband, essentially becoming a living, breathing intim doll. However, I knew that I had 2 big challenges to overcome in order to make this a reality: my naturally strong intimacy need and my physical attraction to him. It wasn't that I fantasized about him, but I also couldn't ignore his rugged masculinity and strong character. He was already barefoot, wearing tan hiking shorts and a blue t-shirt. He took off his t-shirt in one swift movement and sat next to me on the bed, putting his arm around my shoulder. Even though I had been quite active in night before marriage, I was unsure how to act in such unusual circumstances. I was disappointed when I woke up this morning to find Beau no longer in bed. Looking around, I saw a small sink filled with water on his dressing table, with a clean, folded face towel nearby. On the edge of the table was a frame with a photograph of a beautiful brunette holding a boy about 1 and 1/2 years old in her arms. While I was washing, I continued to look around the room, which I was seeing for the first time in daylight. Above his desk, cluttered with technical manuals and scribbled sketches, hung a photograph of Beau with a group of 10 men in combat fatigues. They were all holding assault rifles in different poses, and Beau had patches on his sleeve that I assumed indicated his rank of sergeant. Even through the closed door, I could hear the faint voices of Beau and my husband coming from the kitchen. The moment of truth had come, the moment I was so afraid of. I would have to face my husband after leaving someone else's bed. To make matters worse, that same man was there with him. Well, let's go, I thought, opening the door and entering the kitchen with an air of equanimity that I did not feel. Beau was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, and Don was standing at the sink, his back turned to me. As I approached, Beau looked at me for a moment, but his face remained neutral, as if it was a given. I put my hand on Don's back and kissed him hello. I felt his muscles tense, but he didn't pull away. A pale smile flashed on his lips, but there was no joy in his eyes. As he handed me a cup of coffee, he simply said, "Hi," and leaned on the counter, sipping his coffee. Addressing me but not calling me by name, Beau said, "I fired up the grill. I thought maybe you could make us all some leftovers from that fried egg hash." Without waiting for an answer, he continued, turning to Don, "I want to finish digging and forming this base this morning so we can pour the cement for the turbine base before the end of the day. We'll have to wait a couple of days for it to harden before we start adding the structure." Don asked, "How long do you think this will take?" Although the tone of his question didn't seem particularly enthusiastic, he appeared genuinely interested in the answer. I was relieved that his manner was not confrontational. Given the circumstances, I wouldn't have been surprised if it were, but I still doubted that he had come to terms with our arrangement so quickly. After breakfast, both men left to begin the day's work. I planned to do laundry that day. Beau had a laundry basket in the bathroom on the first floor, and we had one on the second floor. There was a washer and dryer in the room off the kitchen, but Beau explained that we couldn't afford that kind of electricity usage, so the task had to be done by hand, just like in my grandmother's day. There was even a washboard next to the sink for dirty dishes. I actually liked this kind of work because it kept me busy. Unfortunately, this routine also gave me time to think. I didn't think there would be much chance of my husband confronting me about the details of last night, but my mind was busy questioning and answering the various questions he might ask. I worried so much during the day about a possible confrontation that I started to get a headache by the time dawn and I got into bed. Obviously, using this as an excuse to avoid intimacy would have damaged his ego beyond repair. Thinking he was referring to yesterday's adventure, I put my arms around his neck and kissed him hard on the lips. Then I said softly, "It was wonderful, absolutely wonderful." I didn't notice his shocked expression as I continued. "It was uncomfortable at first, but you were so gentle that it soon became pleasant, very pleasant, if you know what I mean." His frown turned into a puzzled one, and at that moment, I realized that he wasn't talking about the intim we had enjoyed yesterday. He wanted to know how my night with Beau went, and it was a series of questions I wasn't ready to answer. Before I could gather my thoughts to respond, he continued, "Yes, it was wonderful, and I'm glad it was something we shared together." He then retorted, "But what I meant was, how was the night with Beau Johnson?" I sat up abruptly, covering my lower body with the sheet and my breasts jiggling as I turned to look at him. My anger grew as I said, "What the hell do you want to know? Don't you want to know every little thing?" I didn't realize my voice was getting louder as my anger grew, but I continued, "You want to know how big he was?" "I don't know, it was dark and I was scared. We didn't have a night, he just had an intim with me, that's all. He was gentle and attentive, but I gave him what you agreed to when you decided that my virtue was worth the price of survival." Seeing the pain on his face after my furious outburst, I calmed down, taking a few deep breaths. I whispered, "Honey, what we do is make love. I will try to make this relationship as clinical as possible, but please remember that what he is doing when he's with me isn't the same as what we do as a loving couple." My words seemed to calm down to some extent, but my problem was whether I really believed what I had just said. I quickly washed my face and got dressed. Before Don and I went downstairs to make breakfast, Beau had already started the fire on the grill and came in through the back door. When I walked into the kitchen, he managed to keep a neutral expression, simply saying, "Good morning, Carrie." Don followed him a few minutes later and received the same greeting, to which he responded hesitantly. I went outside to fry pork and eggs while the two men drank coffee and discussed plans for the day. As I cooked, I wondered vaguely whether our unusual shared arrangement could actually survive, let alone thrive. I had my doubts. It was now Thursday, and it was my second night with Beau this week. While they were outside, I took out a modest nightgown, a spare robe, a spare toothbrush, and hid them in Beau's room. If he found them, which I assumed he did, he didn't mention it. Last night, Don and I made love. This was the first time since we got married that my husband didn't take the time to satisfy me, and it was both annoying and infuriating. So, after dinner, Don went upstairs again without a word, and when Bo took me to his room, not only was I not nervous, but oh my God, I was excited. Bo had proven to be an attentive and capable first-time lover, and I had no reason to think that today would be any different. The candle was lit, but the fading sunlight filtering through the curtains only slightly illuminated the room. There was no talking as he took me into his arms, standing next to the bed. Again, his kisses were soft and gentle. The thoughts of my husband on the stairs below disappeared. Gone was my promise of minimal participation. It was here and now, and my actions were driven by pure desire. The next morning, I woke up to a cool breeze blowing over my body without clothes. The ceiling fan hummed, but Bo had already left. The sun had long since risen, and the memories of the previous night filled me with guilt. At the same time, my body throbbed with pleasure at the memories. I had never experienced such intense pleasure with anyone other than Marty. Not wanting to leave the bedroom and face the possible consequences of Don hearing my passionate sighs from yesterday, I let my thoughts wander. I remembered the last time with Marty. Don and I had been dating for almost 2 months but had not yet become intimate. Although he thought we were exclusive, I had been with Marty several times during that period. We went out to dinner one night and then back to his apartment to have a night. I don't know how Marty could sense my anxiety afterward, but after an unusual silence, he said, "So, baby, I believe you've met someone who can replace me." I didn't answer for a moment and then nodded in response. "Well, have you committed to the relationship yet?" he asked, lightly sighing. I replied, "Not yet, but soon, I think." He added hesitantly, "I know he wants to be exclusive." "Damn, Carrie, if you think he's the one, go for it. We both know you've been looking for Mr. Right. You've dated other guys, probably even slept with a few while we had our, unique friendship. Follow your heart, and hey, if it doesn't work out, you have my number," he joked. That was the last time I saw Marty. The following Saturday, Don and I finally consummated our relationship. But being with Bo wasn't the same as being with Marty. Marty and I were friends, we went to restaurants and danced, and more importantly, we talked. I thought, I've only been with Bo twice, and although last night was even more incredible than with Marty, we barely spoke. How could I betray my husband so quickly and so mercilessly? But didn't he betray me by trading my body for food and shelter? No sooner had the thought crossed my mind than I realized the answer. We had to survive in this new, corrupted world, and Don made the real sacrifice. He goes to bed knowing that his wife is experiencing pleasure in someone else's bed. It's enough to make me hesitate. I sighed out loud again. I had to confront my husband and try to restore some normalcy to our marriage. With that thought in mind, I got dressed and reluctantly headed to the kitchen. To my relief, neither of the men was in the house, and when I looked outside, I saw no sign of activity. The coffee pot was still warm on the table, but it was not clear if they had eaten. Crap, I thought. Don would think that I had been so well that I couldn't wake up. Unfortunately, he was right. Bo usually went to the lake every other day to get water, but when I went into the utility room, I noticed that all 4 water cans were missing. I assumed he had taken Don with him. I was busying myself around the house when, about half an hour later, I heard 2 shots from the forest of the state reserve. My heart almost jumped out of my chest. All I could think about was that one of them was dead, and it was probably my husband. Bo always took his rifle with him into the woods. What if Don heard us last night and, unable to cope physically, confronted Bo, and Bo shot him? What if Don grabbed the gun while Bo was distracted and killed him? My knees were shaking from these thoughts as I headed for the back door. I became completely hysterical as the minutes dragged on with no sign of either of them. Eventually, I saw both dogs run out to the edge of the forest, but they didn't bark, they just stood there looking at the trees. Before I saw anyone, I noticed Elvis's tail was wagging. A moment later, as I was retreating from the forest, I saw Bo. Oh God, he's dragging a body. He killed Don. He killed my husband. I rushed outside, opening the screen door and hurrying towards him. I was halfway there when I saw Don trying to carry the other end of what now looked like an animal. I stopped when I saw Don, relieved to realize it was just my paranoia. The body was an 8-foot alligator, and both men were sweating with the effort of dragging the dead gator across the yard to the heavy wooden table. After they both drank a lot of water and rested for a while, Don said he would go back and start picking up the water cans that were left behind while Bo went inside the house to change out of his sweaty clothes. Having never seen an alligator outside of a zoo, I stood at a respectful distance, studying the beast as if it might come back from the dead and attack me. I was so happy that both my men were safe that I didn't hear Bo leave the house until I felt his arms wrap around my waist and his lips on my neck. He startled me, and when I turned to face him, he bowed his head and kissed me. The kiss was brief but intense. Looking into my eyes searchingly, he said, "Thanks for last night, Carrie. You were fantastic. Your husband is one lucky guy." He kissed me again, and this time I kissed him back. After everything that happened last night, I couldn't understand why I felt ashamed, but I felt the color rise in my face and just smiled shyly in response. My 2 men, I thought, feeling a mixture of shame and excitement. The next 2 weeks passed uneventfully, except that my nights with Bo now included talking. I expected our intimate drive to wane, but if anything, it seemed to only get stronger, and I looked forward to time with him. Don and I still made love a couple of times a week, but his enthusiasm wasn't the same, and frankly, neither was mine. One night, when he tried to have an intim with me, I got angry and pulled away from him. When he asked what was wrong, I answered angrily, "Don, this isn't making love. You're just using me to please yourself. You're not trying to please me anymore. You're not even kissing me anymore. You're just getting down to business." He turned over on his back and, looking at the ceiling dreamily, answered, "You have Bo for that." I was shocked and confused, but before I could respond, he continued, "I hear you, you know. I hear the bed creaking, I hear your sighs, and I see the look of satisfaction on your face in the morning. I can even smell intimate on you before you take a shower." I didn't know what to say. He was right, of course. This old house with no carpets or curtains echoed every sound. The only thing I could think of to say was, "I know it's hard for you, darling, but it's not even twice a week. I'm yours the rest of the time, and I want to be yours." I try not to react, but I'm human and subject to the same animal instincts as we all are. We don't whisper sweet words to each other, and we don't hug in our sleep. It's just a night, pure and simple. We entered into this agreement with our eyes open, not because we wanted to, but because there was no other choice. I just lied to my husband in an attempt to save his feelings. However, the truth is that Bo and I do hug, and we may not say sweet words out loud, but there seems to be an unspoken emotional connection growing between us. I feel it in myself and see it in his eyes. I love Don, but I knew I wanted Bo in my life too. It was selfish, I knew, but our evening conversations moved our relationship from silent intim to something more, maybe not love, but definitely something more. I recently asked Bo about the photo of a woman and child on his dresser. He looked at it silently for a minute before answering, "Laura and Kyle, my wife and son. He was only a year and a half old when they died. I was serving in the army as a ranger in the Middle East when a truck ran a red light and hit their car." He shook his head in disappointment and added, "I only had 10 days left before the end of my service. Just 10 damn days. I'm so sorry," was all I could say. He just nodded sadly. In subsequent conversations, I learned that he grew up in Ohio and worked in his father's construction business, which supplemented the income from the family farm. He learned some skills in electrical work, plumbing, and carpentry, but his real passion was farming. His intention was to follow in his father's footsteps, find a place like this to move with his family, and build a business on the side. Sometime after his discharge, he entered an agricultural college and took courses in agriculture and animal husbandry. He found this place by chance while visiting an old army comrade. He saved most of his salary while serving overseas and was able to buy the place with cash. It required a lot of work, but he figured that with his solitary lifestyle and the skills he had acquired working for his father, it would serve him well. A few years ago, a local farmer who owned an adjoining property to the south sold it to Bo on the cheap. The farmer, who originally planned to cultivate it, grew old and abandoned the idea. When I asked him about his redneck look, he just laughed and said, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. The people here are generally decent, hard-working people, but they are distrustful of outsiders. I come from rural Ohio with its distinct accent, so it wasn't hard to fit in. Besides, many of my army comrades were rednecks, so I already knew their lingo quite well. I was going to ask him about his red-haired friend, but decided not to wake him up. Refugee traffic along the road had decreased significantly, which was evident in the fewer times we heard Patty and Elvis barking along the edge of our property. The windmill, as I called it, was about 80% complete. Construction proceeded slowly because scaffolding had to be erected around it. Once the large metal blades were attached, it was necessary to install the generator and run electrical cables along the entire length of the structure to large batteries and a transformer that stored excess energy and prevented the main panel from being overloaded. At least that's how it was described to me in understandable terms. I now knew it would make our lives much more comfortable, allowing for more appliances and central air conditioning. After that, Bo had a plan to run the PVC pipes he had stored in the rafters of the barn from the lake. He had pumps to irrigate our small farm and even planned to run a line to the house to supply non-potable water that could be used for washing or sterilizing if needed. Now, 6 weeks after we moved in, I began to think of this place as our new home. Dawn, although reluctantly, seemed to accept the inevitability of our continued nocturnal arrangements. However, our marriage suffered. We communicated less, and when we did, our conversations lacked the intimacy they once had. We made love less and less often, and when we did, it was rarely satisfying, at least for me. Honestly, I didn't know what to do with the fact that my affection for Bo was increasing while my love for Dawn was waning. Naturally, I blamed him and his aloofness, both in the bedroom and in our daily interactions. As a result, I looked forward to my time with Bo and the caring way in which he treated our time together. Even alone in his room, he never called me affectionately, darling, sweetheart, or baby. I was always carried to him. We probably both thought that using kind words could lead to a situation that could threaten the existing status quo. However, I knew that Bo was falling in love with me, and it was very difficult for me to suppress the same feelings. On Tuesday, both men were finishing construction work on the windmill when I was getting ready to do the laundry. I had just come downstairs and heard the dogs barking furiously. After placing the laundry basket by the sink in the mudroom, I looked out the front door window. As the barking continued, at first, I didn't notice anything because no one was walking along the road. But the dogs continued to bark at something on the road and did not move along the property line. When one of the dogs moved aside, I saw a body lying there. After a closer look, I realized it was a woman. As I slowly walked out of the house, I was wary of approaching her alone, as Bo had warned us of the possible elaborate tricks that could be used to gain our safety. However, the dogs were there to protect me, so I moved forward carefully. I calmed the dogs, who retreated, growling slightly in protest. The young woman lying on the ground was trying to get to her feet. When I helped her, I saw that she was pregnant. Her clothes were dirty and wet, she looked exhausted, and there was a look of defeat in her eyes. Before I could ask what had happened, she grabbed her stomach, groaning in pain, and fell to her knees. I assumed she had gone into labor, which she confirmed when the contractions subsided. I had watched many poor souls walking along the road in desperate need, but this was different, and I had no intention of abandoning her. When I asked if she could walk home, she nodded. The dogs began to bark again, but when I reproachfully stopped them, Elvis quietly stepped aside. Patty, who had been nothing but tolerant towards me, remained nearby, continuing to grumble her disapproval. Inside, I laid her down on the sofa and put a pillow under her head. "What is your name?" I asked. "Muriel Gantry," she answered weakly. "Thanks for your help," she added, forcing a weak smile. "Don't thank me yet," I thought. Bo won't be happy about this intrusion. But instead, she said, "Get some rest. My husband is in the backyard. I'll go get him." Both men were on the top level of the scaffolding when I shouted to them. "Don, Bo, Don." I heard me and, looking down, shouted, "What?" "I need help, both of you." By then, Bo had heard our brief conversation, and when Don replied that they needed a few minutes to secure the blades, I shouted, "Now. I need you both right now." Bo's first thought must have been intruders, because as he walked down the stairs, he pulled out his pistol, which he always carried with him. Don followed. "You won't need this," I said, nodding at the gun in his hand. "There's a girl inside, and she's giving birth." Bo looked annoyed but didn't say anything as he followed me into the front room. A loud groan of pain preceded us, and when we entered, Muriel was half-sitting, clutching her stomach. Bo stood, looking at the scene in front of him with obvious bewilderment. Dawn, on the other hand, quickly knelt by her side and, in a stern but not angry voice, asked, "How much time between contractions?" Sweat rolled down her forehead as she made a sound. "About 5 minutes, I think." Despite her large belly, she looked very thin and gaunt. Her skin was pale, and there were dark circles around her eyes. "Everything will happen soon," Don said to no one in particular. "We need to move her to the bed." Don looked questioningly at Bo, who nodded and indicated to move her to his bedroom. With this, she began another contraction. "Carrie, there is a blue tarp in the dirty room. Find it and as many clean towels as possible. Lay out the tarp on the bed and cover it with towels. The grill is on. Place a pan of water on it. We will need hot water, but not boiling water. And alcohol too, if we have it. Oh yes," he added after a thought, "get your razor and soap." As I ran off, I heard Bo say, "I'll go and help her." I had already gotten the tarp out and was heading to the closet to get some towels when Bo pulled out a pan to fill it with water. As he walked out the back door to the grill, he looked over his shoulder and said loudly, "Does he even know what he's doing?" "I hope so," was all I said in response, hurrying forward. I knew that Don had volunteered with the Fire and Rescue Brigade and was studying to become certified as a paramedic before we met. When he took the job in Jacksonville, the city had its own professional ambulance service, so he stopped his training. After Bo and I prepared the bed, he and Don helped Muriel onto it. When Bo went to check the wall, Don said, "Help me take off her dirty clothes." Muriel was semi-conscious, except for the moments of contractions that seemed to come every 2 minutes. Bo brought water into the room but disappeared just as quickly. Don told me to clean her upper body as best I could while he took my razor and started shaving her. During this time, she had 3 more contractions, and when we were finished, he covered her with a clean sheet from her chest to her stomach. "Hold her hand and talk to her," Don instructed. "Encourage her to push during contractions. Her pulse is very low, she is suffering from malnutrition, and the shock may be too much for her body." I was scared to death, knowing that the life of this woman and her unborn child hung in the balance. However, Don's self-confidence was like that of an obstetrician, and this kept me from being confused. Muriel seemed to come to her senses a little, and as I encouraged her to push, Don held her knees apart and looked intently between her legs. Finally, he said that he saw the head and, looking up, called, "Come on, dear, like this. Push as hard as you can, but breathe. That's it, take a breath and push again. Breathe now, push again, harder," he demanded. "Like this, take a deep breath and then push, he repeated. I held Muriel's hand and wiped the sweat from her forehead so I couldn't see what was happening. But after one last cry of pain, Muriel lost consciousness. I looked at Don in fear, fearing the worst, but he smiled gently, holding the baby in his arms, and said, "It's a boy." I have never been as proud of my husband as I was at that moment. I later found out that his only training was a lecture and a film about emergency childbirth. He handled the umbilical cord and placenta skillfully and placed the baby on the unconscious mother's breast so that it could feed. Muriel was very weak for the next 2 days and passed out a lot. Don was worried that without proper nutrition, she might not survive or be able to produce the milk needed to feed the baby. He continued to help Bo complete the installation of the wind turbine but spent most of his free time with Muriel and the child. During this time, I was their primary caregiver for the day, preparing light meals of broth, rice, goat's milk, and eggs in small but frequent portions. The men made a cradle with rocking chairs from some extra wood from the barn. As Muriel regained her strength, I helped her go to the toilet, but she was too weak to shower or bathe, so I washed her body with a damp cloth, combed her hair, and, since she could not groom herself, I even shaved her legs. I had seen girls without anything in gym showers, but I had never touched a woman's body so intimately before. She had long, curly brown, almost black, hair, dark brown eyes, and a beautiful face. She was a couple of inches taller than me with smaller breasts, but she must have had a good figure despite her pregnancy. There was sadness in her eyes, but it gave way to loving contentment as she held her child. She thanked me over and over again for the rescue, even though I told her that all the credit went to Dawn. The first night, Dawn slept on a chair next to her bed, and the next 2 nights on the sofa behind the open door. The day had been long and grueling, so I wasn't surprised when Beau moved some of his things into his former master bedroom and didn't join me, even though it was supposed to be our night together. I spent most of the next day caring for Muriel and her newborn son. After I served her lunch, I asked how she ended up in front of our house where I found her. Before answering, she wanted to know if I was aware of the disastrous state of affairs in which we found ourselves. I explained that it was probably an EMP attack, how it affected our lives, and about Beau's ham radio network, without mentioning the specific details of our agreement. I recounted how my husband and I became Beau Johnson's guests, including the incident where I was nearly raped and killed. When I finished my story, she was crying, and after I wiped her tears and calmed her down, she fell asleep. Over the next few days, between bouts of crying whenever she mentioned her husband, Muriel explained what had happened and how she ended up where I found her. She said she lived with her husband Owen in an old house they rented on the outskirts of Jacksonville. Owen left the day before the blackout for a 1-week training in Charlotte. To save money, he took the family sedan rather than fly at the company's expense. He was reimbursed for miles and gas for driving, which earned him a little extra money. Muriel's sister also lived in Jacksonville, so she could come to her aid if Muriel needed someone to drive her anywhere. Muriel was annoyed but not worried when the lights went out. However, a few hours later, her anxiety intensified when she tried to call her sister and found that her fully charged mobile phone was not working. As dusk fell, her anxiety grew, and she went to her neighbor, Mrs. Taro, an elderly widow who had lived alone since her husband died 10 years ago. Since Muriel and her husband were relatively new to the area, the old lady was the only person they really knew. They had taken the widow under their wing, as she lived very modestly. Owen busied himself tending to her garden, which was in dire need of attention, and Muriel often prepared extra food to bring to her at mealtimes. Although Mrs. Taro was a lively and witty woman, she suffered from arthritis and walked with the aid of a cane. After discussing the situation with the neighbor, they agreed that Mrs. Taro would stay at Muriel's for the night with the expectation that the power would be restored by morning. By the start of their 3rd day without power, both women were more than a little concerned about the length of the outage. Adding to their growing anxiety, they also noticed a lack of car traffic and an unusual number of people walking or biking along the street. Muriel approached several travelers, but they either had no idea what was happening or offered theories that ranged from the apocalypse to an alien invasion. The only useful information they received was that the phones were not working, most cars would not start, and conditions in the city were becoming critical due to a lack of water, sewage, and food. Hospitals were closed due to a lack of power, and there were no police to quell the looting and rioting that had begun. Muriel was horrified. Her baby was due in less than 3 weeks, and there was no one to help her but Angie. Not knowing the scale of the disaster, she prayed for the return of her husband. Adding to their misery, the food in the refrigerator had spoiled. They had a limited supply of water left and were trying to manage their human waste. Strangely enough, none of the fleeing citizens approached their house, but on the 10th day, they were startled by a loud knocking on the front door. None of the women dared to answer, they simply remained silent and hid out of sight. Just when they thought the intruders might have left, the front door was suddenly forced open. Muriel screamed as 3 dirty people rushed inside, 2 men and 1 woman, all apparently in their 30s. Angie was screaming at them to go away and leave them alone when the woman, thin but tough-looking, punched her in the face. She hissed in a threatening voice, "Shut up, you old hag. We'll leave when we're ready." Angie fell on her side and clutched her chest, gasping for breath. One of the men, a short bald guy with teardrop tattoos under one eye, grabbed Muriel by the hair and held her in position. Another man, a tall thin guy with a greasy braid and angry dark eyes, shouted to the woman, "Lizzie, check the first aid kit." "I'll check the kitchen." "Dick, stay here with these 2. Angie was still lying on the couch, her face as pale as ash. The guy holding Muriel dug his fingers into her shoulder and, still clutching her hair, pushed her towards the corridor. When they reached the open bedroom door, he led her inside. Muriel was crying and muttering pleas as he pushed her onto the bed. She sat there, scared for her life and the life of her child. When the trio left an hour or so later, they took some food they found, all the medications from the medicine cabinet in the bathroom, as well as some plastic containers of Angie's heart medications that were sitting on the kitchen counter. Luckily, Muriel had hidden some packaged food a few days ago in anticipation of a home invasion. However, they now had no front door, and she felt completely vulnerable. She could not wake the old woman, who had fallen into unconsciousness just a few hours after their ordeal. It was too late for it to help them. She remembered that her husband had a semi-automatic pistol hidden at the bottom of his underwear drawer. She retrieved it but slept restlessly that night in a chair next to Angie, holding the gun in her lap. When she awoke to sunlight streaming through the open front door, Angie was dead. Muriel, still in shock from the previous day's ordeal, collapsed back into her chair and began to cry. Angie was not a small woman, and Muriel could not move her, especially in her condition. Besides, she couldn't stay in the house without a front door and with a dead woman slowly decomposing in the heat. She thought about moving into Angie's house, but memories of the attack put a damper on that idea. Owen had been restoring an old El Camino, working on it little by little in the detached garage attached to the house. With no other choice, she gathered the food she had stashed, consisting mostly of dried instant soups, several boxes of minute rice, some canned stew, 2 cans of Spam, and the remaining water, and moved to the garage. The garage had a standard metal overhead door, dented and rusty. Without power or a functioning door opener, the door could not be opened from the outside. A wooden side door with glass panels gave her access to the cluttered garage. However, without ventilation, it was even hotter than inside the house. Having made her last trip to the house for clothes and other essentials, she was horrified to see that the flies had already found the old woman's body and were swarming around her face. Overcoming her disgust, she sobbed, took the blanket, and covered the dead woman, tucking the blanket under herself as much as possible. Muriel just wanted to preserve as much of her old friend's dignity as possible before leaving. She prayed for Angie, for herself, and for the baby moving in her womb. She also asked God to take revenge on the idiots who killed her, as surely as if they had stabbed her with a knife in her heart. For the next 10 days, the only thought that kept her from committing suicide was the unborn child yearning to see the light of day. Either way, they might both die, she thought, but perhaps the miracle of his birth would herald the miracle that would end all the madness that had befallen them. Her husband's tools were stored in the shed, so she was able to attach a piece of plywood to the glass door panels to prevent the light from the few remaining candles from being visible from the outside. Using large nails she found, she also reinforced the door to at least deter looters. Who wants to break into a garage with a car that won't start? She thought. Sometimes she felt like she was going crazy. The heat was oppressive, and the monotony was maddening. She remembered a prison movie they had once watched where a prisoner was given 90 days of solitary confinement and how he survived the ordeal and was subsequently acquitted. She thought about the March on Bataan, stories about the Hanoi Hilton, and even the old jail in St. Augustine that she had visited. She thought about all the hardships that the men were able to endure and survive. She forcibly implanted these thoughts into her consciousness when she felt uneasy. She soaked dry soups in water until they became soft. The unbearable temperature made the water hot enough that, after a few hours, the dry food became soggy enough to be swallowed. A few days ago, she ate the last of her Spam and canned stew, so there was almost no food left. Her only saving grace was the fact that Owen had a small refrigerator, the type they kept in dorms, in the garage to quench his thirst while working on the car. Water and beer were stored in it. Her fears that pregnant women should not drink alcohol now seemed ridiculous, and in her weakened state, the slight intoxication from the beer provided a small relief from her suffering. However, almost all the food was gone, and the possibility that she would never see her child became increasingly real. The back seat of the El Camino became her living room and bedroom. Empty buckets were her toilet, and despite the fact that she filled them with half-empty cans of paint to muffle the smell, the stench was unbearable. During the day, enough light leaked through the cracks in the dented garage door that she could at least see and move around. The hood of the car was open. Presumably, her husband was working on the engine. Some kind of soft padding was placed on the fender to protect the paint while working under the hood. Out of curiosity, she looked into the engine compartment, and to her inexperienced glance, everything seemed to be in place. There were no loose parts or anything that indicated a problem with the engine. With nothing else to do to pass the time, she got behind the wheel and turned the key. The sound of the engine starting almost scared her to death, and her hand frantically waved, trying to turn it off. She sat there for a long time, thinking about the possibilities this could represent. One thing she knew for sure was that it could offer her an escape from this garage, this prison, this loneliness. Frightened, Muriel turned the key to the accessories position, and the devices came to life. She had never sat in this car before, as it was her husband's territory, and she had little interest in it. Looking at the unfamiliar control panel, she found the fuel gauge and was delighted to see that it showed half a tank. An indescribable feeling of euphoria washed over her. She even checked the headlights and turn signals and was about to check the horn, but at the last moment, she realized the danger of giving away her presence. Realizing that as soon as she opened the hinge door, danger could come face to face with her, she started the car again before opening the door. The dented, rusty door presented the first problem, and it took all her strength to lift it high enough for a car to pass under it. Returning to the car, she put it into gear and, to her surprise, found that the car suddenly moved forward. She didn't know where to go but kept driving, and it felt wonderful. The further she went from the city, the fewer people she encountered. Some shouted at her as she passed by, some tried to stop her, but most looked at her in amazement. There were no other cars, no traffic lights, but on the first leg of her journey, her instincts guided her. As she slowed at stop signs and looked back at the non-existent give-way traffic, realizing the futility of her actions, she simply continued driving without worrying about the rules of the road, trying to keep the sun to the right, figuring that this way she would at least not be driving in circles. 2.5 hours later, the car suddenly stalled. She found herself on a rural road with only gardens around when her water broke and contractions began. The fear was palpable. The only choice was to walk and hope to find shelter from the sun. She seemed to walk for miles and endure several contractions before she collapsed in front of a house, where 2 vicious dogs kept her at bay. Today was supposed to be a trial run of the wind turbine, and I could see the anxiety on their faces as they walked in and out of the house, making adjustments to the system. After several technical problems that they tried to explain to me as they went along, none of which I understood, the main switch was turned on. From that day on, we had air conditioning. Gradually, they began using other electrical appliances, constantly monitoring the system until they felt comfortable with the results. Hurricane season was approaching, and their next project was to replace the barn roof and renovate several sheds on the property. Although Muriel was still weak, her condition improved daily. Her pallor diminished, and the dark circles around her eyes began to fade. One day, while I was changing the baby and Muriel slept, his eyes curiously searched my face as he made little guttural sounds and periodically kicked his legs. I was filled with sadness as I thought about the realities this new life would, or rather, would not, experience. He would never have playmates as he grew up. He would never experience his first day of school. He would only learn what the people here in this lonely place can teach him. He would never have coloring books or toys to develop with. He would never see a movie or watch TV. He would never have any doctor or dentist care. He would never have a driver's license, let alone a car to learn how to drive. He would never have a girl to share his first kiss with. Moreover, he would never know his father or even see his photograph. Muriel woke up and watched me in silence as I wiped the tears from my cheeks. She looked scared when she asked in a concerned voice, "Carrie, what happened? Is the baby okay?" I laughed. She hadn't talked about a name yet and just called him baby. Yes, he's fine. He's so cute," I said, and it brought tears to my eyes. I knew Bo was very busy all day, but during the times he came in and out of the house, he seemed uncomfortable in my presence and never showed affection or interest in the baby. Don, on the other hand, spent most of his evenings playing with the baby or keeping Muriel company. He loved being a surrogate father, and one day, as I watched him gently pat the baby on the back and rub him as he burped, I felt a surge of jealousy. It should have been my child that he was comforting. I was supposed to be the mother he caressed. The constant rain, which began during the day, continued into the evening. This was very useful since we were suffering from a long drought and it was affecting the harvest. After dinner, when Don went upstairs, Bo sat on the couch reading by the light of our new electricity. I hadn't slept with my husband since the baby was born, but tonight I had to sleep in Bo's room. He put the book down and smiled faintly as I sat next to him, on the edge of the couch. Instinctively, I knew something was wrong and needed to be found out, so I immediately asked Bo, "Are you upset that I helped Muriel and brought us to your house?" He took my hand and, after a moment of thought, answered, "No, Carrie, not at all. I would do the same. Oh, I know I've sent people away, even families, to meet some fate far down the road, but that's a far cry from letting an innocent person die on your doorstep." He looked away for a few moments as if formulating his next words before continuing, "Honestly, she and the baby should probably be grateful for Don's life. I wouldn't have been able to help much if he hadn't taken the initiative. You know, I've never seen my son, only in photographs. I was in a strange wilderness, taking lives rather than saving them. When my son was born, all I could think about was how much I wanted to be in that delivery room when he first opened his eyes. How I wanted to be the first person he saw when he was born. That's why I couldn't stay in the room the other day. Even now, the memory hurts. I'm glad you did what you did, Carrie. Perhaps playing even a small role in their survival will atone for some of the things I had to do. They are definitely welcome here in our home." There were tears in my eyes as he hugged me and pressed me to his chest. We slept together that night but never fully realized the love we now had for each other. The transition was slow. Don and I stuck to our agreement, but despite my feeble attempts to make love to him, he gently rejected them all. I think he knew he had lost me. I still love Don and always will, but not with the passion of lovers, not like a husband and wife. After about a month, I gave up the pretense and never slept upstairs again. One night, after we had an intimate, we lay quietly in each other's arms when my new husband chuckled. When I asked him what was funny, he whispered, "Just listen." I began to smile in the darkness, hearing faint sounds of pleasure and the creaking of the bed coming from above. 10 months later, I was lying in bed with my legs spread, and Muriel was squeezing my hands and demanding that I push hard. With one last spasm of pain, my ex-husband brought my little daughter into this world with a happy B. Johnson standing by his side. What do you think of our story today? In my opinion, it's not a pleasant situation when your wife puts the fact that she's going to sleep with another man in front of you. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. See you in the comments.